Good morning, everybody, and thank you for that warm welcome, Karen. It's a privilege to be speaking here today at the Christian Faith and Freedom Conference, and I listened to the amazing talk given by Elizabeth and just want to honour the work that Christian Faith and Freedom is doing. And I think the title of this organisation is so key because it clearly shows that you cannot really have freedom without Christian faith. Throughout the world, the places where people, not just Christians, but all people are most free are those where the Christian faith has historically had the deepest penetration. So it's great to be here today to see such a fantastic lineup of speakers and to be part of this conference. My name's John Steenhof. I am one of the minority of Western, middle-class, imperialist Christians. Thankfully, I'm vastly outnumbered by my brothers and sisters throughout the world. And the title of my talk is Religious Freedom in a Brave New World, analysing the threats to Christianity in Australian society. And I hope everyone can see the PowerPoint that I'm putting up here. If you can't, you can always move forward and join us here at the front. Churches everywhere are the same. They fill up from the back. This is actually pretty good today. So, where are we going to go today? I'll give you an introduction so you know exactly where we're up to. First, I want to tell you a little bit about Human Rights Law Alliance and what we do. Then I'm going to talk to you about the spirit of the age. What is the worldview of Australia and how it's changed? I want to talk about the brave new world that we're in. I'll give you a bit of a talk about religious freedom and the shape that takes in Australia, the threats that we're seeing to religious freedom, particularly legally at HRLA, and a Christian response. So firstly, Human Rights Law Alliance. We're a not-for-profit law firm that is based here in Canberra. We're supported by donations through the ACL, which is our parent organisation, and we have a specialist focus on legal matters and advocacy on religious freedom. So, our sole focus is religious freedom, freedom of speech, thought, expression, association. We're here to help Christians, to help churches, to help Christian organisations. We began life incubated in the Australian Christian Lobby, and the former managing director was Martin Isles. I'm sure everyone here knows Martin very well, who's now taken up the role of managing director of ACL. And really, it started as a clearinghouse for Christians to bring their religious freedom issues, and then Martin would match them with lawyers throughout Australia. Given the volume of work that came through the door, it was decided to now set HRLA up as a fully independent law firm. And this largely is the brainchild of one of our other speakers today, Jim Wallace, who's with us here. And I want to honour him, particularly because he's one of my board members. So he sets my wages. So thank you, Jim, for bringing me over here to Canberra to do this work. So we're still linked with the ACL, closely working with them. And we're trying to create an environment where there's a mature voice for Christian freedom that's set through relevant litigation, where we take key cases to protect religious freedom, but also to be a voice at the table where governments, federal, state, and territory are looking at laws that would detract from or affect religious freedom, or even protect religious freedom, like the upcoming Religious Discrimination Act that's currently being considered federally. All right, let's get into it. I want to talk to you about the spirit of the age because to analyse threats to Christianity in Australia, we need to understand what is the current state of Australian society. Now, all of us are part of a society that has a worldview. I want to talk to you about the zeitgeist. Who knows what the zeitgeist is? Anybody? It's a German term which refers to, transliterated, time ghost, zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age. And what it's talking about is the intellectual fashion or the dominant school of thought that influences your particular culture at this particular time. The zeitgeist is like a massive river of cultural norms and ideas that we all float down and exist within. Now, as any of you who've been in a river would know, you don't notice the current while you float along with it. But as soon as you turn around and try to swim against it, that's when you can feel its force and know what's pushing against you. And often it is Christians who are at the forefront of turning and swimming against the tide. Unfortunately, even if you swim against the tide, you still get wet. I think the Word of God is like a massive rock. Christianity is a rock that sits in this river of the zeitgeist. Now, the rock of ages, Jesus Christ, has various influences within the culture. And where the culture intersects with the face of that rock, where the water hits up against the rock, you have this roiling and turbulence. It's a place of conflict, storm, and tempest. But do you know what it creates on the backside of the rock? It creates an eddy. The downstream side of that rock is peaceful and quiet. Now, I know that we have some people here. Who's a fisherman in our midst? Jim Wallace. So Christianity is like this rock that we see in the river. And as every fisherman will know, behind that rock is a calm spot where it's great to fish. Above the rock is the turbulence. So we have Christians on both sides of this rock in our society. We have those Christians who are facing up against the culture where there's this turbulence and they're facing a lot of challenge and opposition. But what that does is allows Christians on the other side of the rock to live peacefully, to live calmly, and to pursue their goals. And I thought it would be good in this conference, which is talking both about Australia and overseas, to use the example of Tim Costello. Some of you may remember, do you know who Tim Costello is? So Tim Costello is a Baptist minister, a man of faith. And earlier this year, he was quite prominent in talking about religious freedom. He said he did not see any evidence of persecution of Christians in Australia. And he famously said, Christians need to suck it up. He says, I don't think there is a risk of persecution. Christians need to calm down. And he said, I would say to Christians, if you want to see persecution, let me take you to where there is persecution of Christians and other religious groups. Let me take you to Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, and I will show you persecution. Now, in one way, Costello is right. We hear the stories talked about by Elizabeth, and Christians in Australia are not facing that same level of opposition. It is not really persecution. We have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood, as the apostle says in the book of Hebrews. So Christians face hostility, ostracisation, exclusion from the public square, and the silencing of our voices in Australia, but we're not facing death, imprisonment, and torture in the same way that Elizabeth told us about. But there's another way that Costello is wrong. Costello is a man who sits in the calm shadow of the rock. He's in the peaceful water that's created by the Christians who stand on the other side and face this opposition. He doesn't know what the fuss is on the other side, but he's protected by it. So he does advocate on important issues like poverty, climate change, refugees. But his freedom to do that depends on a society where not just fashionable Christian ideas are protected, but also those Christian convictions that are out of step with society, that go against the stream. So let's look a little bit at our society and what we face in Australia, and I've talked about this in the context of Brave New World. All of you are probably familiar with the book 1984 by George Orwell. And many say on a regular basis we live in Orwellian times, that Western culture resembles the totalitarian regime that George Orwell described in 1984. So we have memes like this, which have someone grabbing 1984 and saying, just moving this book into my non-fiction section. Because we see an increasingly big brother society that requires citizens to conform to a uniform ideology, where people can be convicted of thought crime, where they require you to say 2 + 2 = 5, where those who fall out of favour become unpersons, and where brazenly misleading terminology is used, and there's a clear manipulation of truth and facts. But I think that the current spirit of the age is not so much 1984 as it is Brave New World. Brave New World's by Aldous Huxley. It precedes 1984 by about 15 years. And it's also a novel that describes a dystopian future that at first resembles a utopia. This is a world that's given over to hedonism, sexual permissiveness, and a permanently medicated society that is kept in check by its elites. Does that sound familiar? It follows the story of Bernard Marx, who is one of the elites in the society who rebels against that society. I don't want to tell you the story, but I want you to consider some of the key elements of the world of Brave New World. The civilized world is ruled by an elite class, and people are kept under control by regular medication with the drug soma. There is an elevation of communal sports and promiscuous sexual activity as the opiates of the masses and the norms to which you must conform. There are no families. Children are engineered in labs and raised by the state, so there's no natural parenting. Children are indoctrinated from an early age in their sleep to reject traditional morality and to adopt the culture and ethics of the new society, which has views that are chillingly reminiscent of our times on the sanctity of life, the termination of the ill, sexuality, identity. Humanity is slave to technological wonders and consumerism, so live a very shallow life. There's a death of intellectual learning, individual thought, human dignity and personal freedom. There are places in the world where they practice marriage, religion, natural birth, monogamy and family. But these are only unenlightened simpletons who live in savage reservations. Does that not resonate with what we see in 21st century Australia? We live in a time of hedonism, relativism, materialism, and personal autonomy. But we don't need a book from the 1930s to tell us about this, do we? The Bible tells us that this is the natural state of the world. Romans 1 says, "For although they knew God, they did not honour him as God. They became futile in their thinking. They exchanged the glory of God for images, the truth for a lie, and they worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator." When you see climate extinction rebellion protests in our cities, you see that the creature, that nature has been elevated above God. The natural order of things in the Bible is creator, creature, and nature. When we upend that and exchange the truth for a lie, we have nature first, then the created beings, and finally the Creator at the bottom of the pile. Philippians 3 talks about this as well. It talks of a world where their end is destruction, their God is their belly, hedonism, and their glory is in their shame, with their minds set on earthly things, materialism. 1 Peter 4 says, "The world is surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you." So, how do we see this brave new world in our society? Well, we see it in culture, politics, church, and family. Let's talk about culture. Culturally, we've seen a shift towards a progressive elite ideology that's described as cultural Marxism. Who's familiar with this term, cultural Marxism? The central idea of it is that it is to soften and prepare Western civilization for an elite state that runs all aspects of our lives. And it involves a gradual but relentless attack on every institution of Western culture. Its Christian foundations, parenting, schools, literature, art, and film, the family, sexual morals, and national sovereignty. These things are all under attack. And what they want you to do is frame everything in terms of power, oppressor, and the oppressed. So the members of the oppressed class are always in a struggle to gain power from the oppressor. So we're all divided into small little groups defined by the different characteristics of either oppressor and oppressed. It wouldn't be any surprise to you that I would have most of the characteristics of oppressor. But the members of the oppressed class would include women, minorities, homosexuals, adherents of non-Western ideologies such as Islam. And it's all about power and splitting people into warring tribes, ultimately so that the state takes over the relationships between those and the control of the people. So we see this in our media, we see it on TV, we see it in the newspapers and in our entertainment. What's happening at a political level? In politics, we see an increasing commitment to hedonism, individualism, and relativism. Federally and at state and territory levels, we see things like the Safe Schools program being introduced into our schools, with the increasing conditioning of our children into ideas of sexual fluidity, sexual promiscuity that have no place in a Christian society. We've had the legalisation of homosexual marriage, which is autonomousness and relativity in action. We've seen the gender on birth certificates now being something that one can change at will in Victoria and also in Tasmania. We're seeing prostitution legalised in South Australia, and we're seeing all jurisdictions seriously considering hate speech laws to protect a person's conception of self, to make sure that they are not offended by the ideas of other people which would come into conflict with their own identity. That's why I do like the verse that's been chosen for this conference from Isaiah 59, that truth is nowhere to be found. There is no justice. There is no one to intervene. Elsewhere in Isaiah, I think in Isaiah 5, it says, woe to you who call evil good and good evil. We see this everywhere at a political level. But we've got the church, don't we? How are we going in the church? Sadly, the church has increasingly capitulated to the ideology around it and been rotted from within. With a few exceptions, churches have either become disengaged with speaking truth into the public square, or they have abandoned the gospel altogether, and they just conform to whatever are the fashionable ideas of the world, the zeitgeist. So they've imbibed on this modern fixation on hedonism and relativism and materialism. Our church services are no longer about the worship of God, but about the entertainment of the person. On social issues, they're always $1 short and a day late, but they eventually get round to whatever the popular view is in the world. You see critics of Orthodox Christianity in all of the major faith traditions. You've got Father Rod Bauer, the billboard priest from Gosford, who's always putting up progressive billboards in front of his church. You've got Reverend Inkpin, the transgender priest in Queensland, who's going out advocating in schools, organisations, the beauty of the transgender lifestyle and acceptance within the church. You've got Father Frank Brennan in the Catholic Church, who's always a spokesperson on the ABC for the latest progressive issues. It reminds me of a passage from Lycidas, the poem by John Milton. I'm hoping there are people in this room who know John Milton. When he talked about the ministers of his age, he said, "The hungry sheep look up and are not fed, but swollen with wind and the rank mist they draw, rot inwardly and foul contagion spread. We are at dire times in the church, and never has there been such a time as this where the church needs to be standing up and confidently speaking the truth. What's happening in our families? Well, we've had a radical change of the way families work. Since the free love movement of the 1960s, we've seen unprecedented family breakdown in our society. We've seen progressive values in parenting, starting with Dr. Benjamin Spock. Everyone's heard of Benjamin Spock. He was starting in the 60s and 70s. And things have gotten worse from there, which means that with the breakdown of the family has come the state stepping in to take on the role of parent for children. Education is now not just the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Our education now goes to all of the things that parents used to do within the family. We have a mental health crisis that grows at the same rate as social media encroaches on our lives and technology encroaches on our children. And our phones are like the mind-numbing drug, Soma, that Brave New World talks about, keeping the people addicted, calmed, and medicated. So when we look at our Western society, we see a society in decline. And I want to wrap up this analysis of our Brave New World with a quote from Malcolm Muggeridge, a great Christian scholar of the mid-20th century, Malcolm Muggeridge. He says this about Western society: "So the final conclusion would surely be that whereas other civilizations have been brought down by attacks of barbarians from without, ours had the unique distinction of training its own destroyers at its own educational institutions, and then providing them with facilities for propagating their destructive ideology far and wide, all at the public expense. Thus did Western man decide to abolish himself, creating his own boredom out of his own affluence, his own vulnerability out of his own strength, his own impotence out of his own erotomania, himself blowing the trumpet that brought the walls of his own city tumbling down, and having convinced himself that he was too numerous, labelled with pill and scalpel and syringe to make himself fewer, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility and polluted and drugged himself into stupefaction, he keeled over, a weary, battered old brontosaurus, and became extinct." He has a turn of phrase that I think is quite compelling, if it lacks a little in optimism. So this is the Western society that we are part of, and in which we seek religious freedom, the freedom to practice our belief. So in a dying culture, a culture of hedonism, relativism, materialism, autonomy, where does religious freedom sit? Well, religious freedom is not well protected in Australian law, but we are signatories to international covenants which describe pretty well what it is that Christians and people of other religions seek in our culture. Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights sets out a nice summary of what it is that Christians, and it is largely Christians who have done this, have been able to set down as the real principles of religious freedom. We have firstly freedom of religion, which is the freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief of your choice. We have freedom of thought, the freedom to encounter and to hold ideas and to engage and consider them. Freedom of speech, the freedom to express those ideas, to exchange them in public and in private, and to discuss those ideas, debate them, sometimes robustly, all without interference. And the freedom of conscience, the freedom to follow the dictates of the deeply held principles of the soul. Now, what does that look like in detail? Well, there's some nice key principles that I want to take you through that are set out in our international covenants, which are under attack here in Australia. The first is that these are rights that can be experienced individually or in community. If you read newspapers today, when they talk about cases like Israel Folau and the like, they say, it's fine for Israel to believe things, but he should keep it to himself. Happy for you to believe things in your head, but don't express it. Well, we are given the right to exercise religious freedom individually or in community, in public or in private, in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. This is not something that is confined to a worship hall on a Sunday or a Saturday if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, if we have any here. Anyone bold enough to put up their hand? The idea is that there should be no coercion of the conscience, that there should be narrow limitations of the right to religious freedom. So you should only limit religious freedom where it's absolutely necessary as prescribed by law, or to protect public safety, order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. It includes the right to opinions without interference, the right of association, which often doesn't get mentioned, but that is the right to form communities and organisations, to set the rules of who joins, to set the rules of how that people can be kicked out of the group, and to be able to organise and operate on the principles that motivate you. And lastly, education. Parental rights are particularly mentioned in the ICCPR. So the states, including Australia, undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions. That's a right that we've said parents have, and yet it's a right that's under attack in most Western civilizations as the state takes over what is a parental role. So religious freedom rights, as described here, are a uniquely Christian conception. If you look at the equivalent Muslim Declaration of Human Rights, the Cairo Declaration, it contains nothing about religious freedom. If you look at the nations in the world where these freedoms have been established imperfectly, they're all nations that have been largely influenced and driven by Christian principles and dogma. In Australia, we don't have any proper legal protections as such of our religious freedom. There's a patchwork of laws that are there. Most of that protection has come from these values, these virtues being baked into our culture and laws without formal expression. But as culture and laws change, what happens to those freedoms? So that's what I want to talk to you about, is the threats to religious freedom. And I want to talk to you about the lived experience of Christians who are represented by the HRLA and others in this brave new world. So where are those threats coming from? Well, we see careers under threat, that employers, regulators, people who oversee professions are all having a very strong influence and strong penetration into the personal lives of their employers, and their careers can be under threat for their orthodox Christian beliefs. We see hostility in the workplace to even the most benign expressions of Christian belief. We see Christians increasingly being excluded from opportunities in the public square. We see the weaponisation of discrimination claims under anti-discrimination legislation. And we see Christians forced against conscience. These are the 5 key areas that we've identified in our case law that Christians are increasingly under threat in Australian society. Now I'm going to take you through an example of each of these, but these are just examples of many of the cases that have happened in Australia. And if you'd like to see more examples, you can look at our HRLA website and our latest news, where we've put together a list of 33 plus cases in all of these categories of Christians who are facing hostility and threat for their religious freedom. So let's go and have a look at some of these cases. Careers under threat. The first case here is Melissa. This is a case that's current, so we've de-identified the actual doctor, but Melissa is a GP who's been practicing for 15 years. Melissa never has had a complaint against her of discrimination or treatment of anyone in a different way during her practice as a doctor. She's never had a complaint from another medical practitioner about the standard of care that she provides in a suburban GP practice. However, Melissa posts about Christian issues on Facebook and on other internet sites, blog sites. This came to the attention of some activists who decided to make anonymous complaints to the medical board. Now, these people were not patients of this doctor. All they had seen were thoughts and comments they did not like on social media, and they reported this to the medical board. Some of the posts were on same-sex marriage during the marriage postal vote. A lot of them were on transgenderism, radical feminist theory, and a lot of conservative political positions. So they were not exclusively religious posts. Now, the medical board started an investigation of Melissa. It seemed clear from these posts that from these complaints that the complaints were politically motivated and had nothing to do with this person's practice as a doctor. There are powers within the regulatory framework to dismiss complaints out of hand where they're vexatious and they really aren't focused on the person's medical practice. But that wasn't done. The medical board not only took on the complaint, but it failed to notify this doctor that the complaint had been lodged, which is what they're required to do by law. They also failed to keep this doctor updated on the complaint every 3 months, which they're required to do, but instead embarked on an investigation of not only the posts that were identified by this activist, but also every Facebook post that this doctor had ever made. They gave the doctor a notice of investigation after 13 months and said, here are the areas that we're worried about. We need you to give us some submissions as to why we should not commence discipline against you. She wrote in a response setting out a defence of many of the posts, which were orthodox Christian beliefs on sexuality, identity, life. One of the articles was just a purely medical article on transgenderism, which was put in a very generic Christian newspaper. It was hardly provocative and inflammatory. There was radio silence for a further 6 months. Then, on a Friday afternoon, we were called and told, there's been a second anonymous complaint that we're sending through to you at 2:30 on a Friday afternoon. That was sent. The complaint was of the same substance as the first one. They had also not reported it to him, but had sat on it for 6 months. An hour later, we get another call from the medical board saying, the medical board has done a thorough investigation and met yesterday. Within 7 days, we're holding another hearing next Friday in Melbourne, where the medical board proposes to remove this doctor's registration so they can no longer practice medicine, using emergency powers, because we think there's a real danger to the patients and to the public of Australia. They sent through the decision of the medical board. They sent through 2,500 pages that they had amassed, where they had found every single thing that this doctor had ever published on the internet since 2005. Most of it was theological discussion on Christian websites, but they had employed a forensic firm at great cost to undertake this investigation, all while this client, this doctor, had no clue that any of this was going on. The doctor had 7 days, less than 7 days, to appear the next Friday to make submissions, and it had all the elements of a Soviet show trial where she turned up, she gave her testimony, she said that she had taken down and hidden all of the offensive posts that had been identified, was willing not to make any more posts while she was being investigated. That wasn't good enough for the medical board, and this doctor has lost her license to practice as a doctor. Now think about that. This doctor never had a complaint from an actual person. This doctor has been a GP to many people who have different gender identities, who are of different sexualities, without a hint of complaint. It was only because of this thought crime, this posting of material on the internet, that the medical board came in and has put her career under threat. She's not the only one. There are plenty of doctors, counsellors, pharmacists who have faced this kind of investigation and this kind of hostility. And it is a silencing of the Christian voice in the public square by attacking people's jobs. If you don't like what someone's saying, if you don't like someone's ideas, do you know what you meet it with? Ideas. You don't attack people's jobs. Let's move on to the case of hostility in the workplace. And the example I use here is Jane, who is a senior executive in the public service. And she's voiced her support for traditional marriage and for the cases of Margaret Court and Israel Folau. Now the context is this, is that Jane is often part of management meetings and the kinds of meetings that all of us in employment have to go to. And in the spaces around these meetings, when they're not officially being held, there's the usual conversation about sports, politics, the issues of the day. The contemporaries of Jane around the table prior to meetings often talk about the issues of the day, one of those being at one stage at Margaret Court. And everyone in the room was almost universally critical of Margaret Court in the stance she took over homosexual marriage, and were belittling her before this meeting. This employee stands up, doesn't rage or sort of take the prophetic voice of the Old Testament on this, simply says, look, I kind of agree with Margaret Court. I think she should be entitled to her opinion. On another occasion, they did the same with Israel Folau, talking about what a dunce Israel Folau is, what a troglodyte. And he said, look, Israel Folau is entitled to his views. In fact, I'm one of the people who agree with him. For those grievous crimes, contemporary workers of this person, Jane, I'm calling her in this example, reported her to her superior, saying that her views made them feel unsafe and breached the generic code of conduct that governs their employment. So Jane was brought into performance management conferences. She was there with HR being told about the requirements to be tolerant, to promote diversity and inclusion. She was told that there were people who were feeling unsafe. Then Jane was subsequently brought to an off-site meeting where it was to clear the air, where many of her contemporaries said, in a room, we feel unsafe because of your religion. Very clearly. Jane is now being effectively performance managed out, will be given redundancy, and probably is going to take it because the workplace is a hostile place for her. Let's talk about exclusion from opportunities. This case here is currently a case in Western Australia that we're running through the courts. Chris and Mary are a West Australian couple. They found it on their hearts that they wanted to be involved in foster parenting, having other friends in church who were involved in fostering and seeing the great need in society for children who are the product of broken homes, broken families, and need help. So they made an application with a local foster care provider to become foster parents and went through stage 1 with flying colours. They had interviews, they undertook courses, they answered a lot of questions about their own personal lives and their own personal convictions. When they went on to go for formal assessment as foster carers, it became clear that as Christians they held traditional beliefs about gender and sexuality. And their application was rejected on the basis that their home would therefore be unsafe as a place for children to be fostered. Now, they said, look, We would love any foster child that's placed with us. And if we had a long-term foster placement and that child began to experience same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria, we would love them as we love our own children and we would not kick them out. But if a child was to be placed with us who already identified that way, then we would have to decline that placement. Now, this is a standard part of fostering, that you're trying to match appropriate children with appropriate parents, and that there is no requirement that every foster carer be appropriate for every foster child. This situation is compounded by the fact that they were looking to foster as temporary respite carers. That means they're not looking for a full-time placement. They're looking for to relieve full-time carers who need a break on weekends, at times where there are emergencies. And they were only looking to foster children between the ages of 0 and 5. But they were told that their traditional Christian beliefs on sexuality made them unsafe to be even considered further as foster care applicants. They're great parents. They've got 2 children of their own. They provide a remarkably stable environment, and they have the support of a wider Christian community and Christian family that would make these people ideal foster parents. When we were able to get the correspondence as part of the complaint that we took through the Equal Opportunity Commission, it showed that not only were they being targeted, the assessment body said, look, we think we may have other people in our fostering system who hold the same unsafe views as Chris and Mary. We're going to need to start to do reviews to try to weed these people out. So Chris and Mary are taking this case not just for themselves, but to ensure that other Christians don't face the same exclusion that they do. One of the incredible blessings that we have on this case is that when I was leaving Western Australia, I was having a lunch to say goodbye to some of the barristers that I've worked with in the past in my commercial practice. And one of them is a very senior SC, or QC as they're called around here, very senior barrister. And he says, well, tell me about some of the cases you're doing. So I told him about this case. And we've been able to engage a top barrister absolutely free. He's offered his services and he's doing the work pro bono on this case. How wonderful is that? And this is a man who is a completely godless and unchristian man, but who sees the injustice of this. When we came to briefing a junior barrister, I talked to a number of other people who I've worked with in the past. I didn't ask for it to be done for free. We've got a free junior barrister as well. So there is no requirement for any payment of legal fees on this matter. And both our junior and senior counsel expect that this may go quite far, maybe even to the High Court. It's one of those important cases. So praise God. That's a miracle. Moving on, let's talk about the weaponisation of discrimination claims. And the most recent case that's just been in the news in the last month is Ballarat Christian School. Has anyone seen this? So Ballarat Christian School is being sued by Rachel Colvin. It's been all over the news. She is being backed by Equality Australia and has a number of pro bono lawyers and counsel working for her to complain about constructive dismissal from the school. So the school didn't actually fire her, but she's saying constructively, they fired me because of my beliefs on sexuality and gender. Now, she had taken leave from school and came back to school, and the school had updated and reviewed its policies on sexuality and gender in the wake of the marriage campaign. She was told, you need to teach an orthodox, traditional Christian conception of marriage. She says, but I don't agree with that. I think that same-sex marriage is good and that we need to endorse LGBTQI lifestyles. They said to her, look, you can believe that. We won't fire you for that. They could. But we need you to teach what this school confesses. She's taken a discrimination claim against the school. Here you have a small Christian school that's parent-controlled and parent-run, that's funded receives substantial government funding, but as substantially also has to survive on the smell of an oily rag from funding from parents. It's now got to engage in the stress, in the diversion of resources to this kind of claim. And this is not unusual for activists to take claims. Think Archbishop Porteous in Tasmania, when he had the cheek, had the gall of teaching Catholic doctrine to Catholic people in Catholic schools in a document setting out Catholicism. Someone took objection and said, this is discrimination. Now that claim was dropped, but it distracted him away from a marriage campaign where we were already outnumbered, but never outgunned, but certainly was something he could have done without, and it's a familiar tactic used against Christians to silence their voices. Christians forced against conscience is the last major heading that I want to talk about here. And this is another West Australian case of Jason Tay. Incidentally, next weekend is the ACL National Conference in Sydney. It's not that far away as a place or as an event. And Jason Tay is going to be there to talk about his actual experience in this claim. So he was a photographer who was sued for discrimination after a complaint from a lesbian woman who was a former classmate of his, who asked him to take photos of her and her partner for a commitment ceremony. Jason said to them, look, I'm happy to do the work, but let me just tell you that I'm a Christian and I have deep convictions on sexuality, which may mean I can't do the best job that I can. And he nicely said, there's plenty of other photographers out there who can do this job. Jason was taken to the Equal Opportunity Commission. The Equal Opportunity Commission funded the claim by these activists. The Equal Opportunity Commission didn't throw the claim out, but instead pushed it on and said, we think there is a claim, and sent it to the next higher tribunal. And it was only after some work in that tribunal that the claimant took that claim and withdrew it. But it meant a lot of time, distraction, stress for Jason. And yet, when you speak to Jason, you hear of a man whose faith was deeply strengthened by the experience. We've got 5 minutes left. We've talked about some of these cases. A lot of people get to the end of these cases and they go, this is really discouraging. John's told us that Australian culture is going down the toilet, that Christians everywhere are under attack and under threat. And yet, there is hope. I think there is a Christian response, and it's one that can be done confidently and with courage. The first is to talk about cultural engagement. What do you do when you are in a culture that is hostile to Christianity? You've got two options. There's a book by Rod Dreher called The Benedict Option. Has anyone read The Benedict Option? Well, it's worth reading. In this, Rod says Christians should be setting up separate communities that are like a beacon on the hill, much like the Benedictine monks did, that we wall ourselves off from society and show them from a distance the way that Christians should live. You've also got Augustine, who wrote The City of God. His view of the Christian in society was that the Christian city is a city which exists within the city of Athens, the city of Babylon. It is a sanctifying influence within that city. Between those two options, I think Augustine had it right. We are called to be active within our society. Elizabeth showed how other Christians are being active within societies that are much more hostile than our own. We do have things that we can be thankful for. We've got the election of Scott Morrison, a visibly Christian Prime Minister, but he's not going to save society. We've got the federal government considering a Religious Discrimination Act, but no legislation will save society. HRLA is a law firm that helps Christians, but litigation is not going to save society. We need cultural engagement. I want to read with you from Matthew 5. It says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." That's the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. The theologian James Montgomery Boyce talks about this, and he says, "The Christian is to be a preserving force in the world wherever God has placed him. The salt never did any good when it was sitting on the shelf and the meat on the other shelf. To be effective, the salt has to be rubbed into the meat. In a similar way, Christians must allow God to rub them into the world. And this means that they must be Christians at work, Christians in politics, Christians at home, Christians everywhere else that a normal life in their own society would take them." Oh, someone says, that would mean that I have to be taken out of the salt shaker and spread around, and I might get dirty and even seem to dissolve or disappear? Yes, that is exactly what it means. But God is the one who provides the flavour, and the flavour does not disappear when the salt is dispensed or dissolved. Can I hear an amen? Amen. Amen. As we engage, we need to remember the words of Titus 3, which says, "Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and always be gentle." God requires you to be faithful and wise in the way that you engage in your community and in your culture. So let me encourage you to do that, because many a Christian has prejudiced themselves by being a jerk. If you're persecuted for being a jerk, that is not what God blesses. It's when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. I think we need a new language as well. We have been consumed by a language of values. We even talk about these things called Christian values. And Professor Ian Benson from Notre Dame University rails against this. He says values are meaningless. They're relativistic, they're autonomous, and they can't judge each other. What we need is not this fragmentation into different values. Well, I have my Christian values, you have your Buddhist values, we have Australian values. Somehow we can't define them, but people have to agree with them when they come to our country. We need to get back to virtues. Values are things like tolerance, diversity, and inclusion. Those words mean nothing by themselves. Diversity by itself just means I have lots of stuff. That's neither good nor bad unless you attach it to something that is supposed to be diverse. But we should talk about virtues, truth, justice, righteousness, prudence, temperance, courage. The other thing we need, and I'm aware I'm running out of time, is a Christian voice. The Bible warns about wolves in sheep's clothing, but what we often face in the church are what Churchill called sheep in sheep's clothing. We need shepherds who are unashamed of the message of the gospel. God's plan for mankind is true, good, and beautiful, and we need to be confident to speak it when it comes to issues of life, issues of identity, issues of sex. God's way is a much better way, and a good shepherd, the clergy, needs to lead from the front. And the last thing I want to leave you with is head, heart, and hands. Again, I've borrowed this from a friend of mine, Mark Snedden, who's a great advocate in this religious freedom space for much longer than me. Firstly, use your head, get informed, make yourself familiar with those places where you can get information. We've got the ACL putting out resources all the time. We've got Christian Faith and Freedom putting out resources which are excellent, densely packed with good information about the church around the world. We've got the Institute for Civil Society that puts out publications on religious freedom issues. HRLA does regular news releases on issues of interest in the legal sphere. We've got Eternity News. We've got Christian Post. We have all these resources where Christians can use their heads and get informed. You have to use your heart as well, because our battle is not against flesh and blood. We're dealing with real people, and not all of them are activists. So be loving and gentle as you engage, and remember that Christ himself raged at the church and raged at the clergy and was very gentle with normal members of the community. And lastly, use your hands. What's the best thing that hands can do? They can get involved in ministry. You can get involved and volunteer in various organisations, even if it is just picking up a phone to an MP or writing a submission or being part of a campaign. The best thing hands can do is praying. Pray for all in authority for the church, and pray that God's kingdom will come and that his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We can be confident because we've read the last page. We know who wins. We know that only Christ can usher in a world that is truly brave and which is truly new. So that should give us confidence and expectation as we live our life as Christians in this brave new world below. Thank you very much.